Welcome to this session, Trade, Now What? I'm Stephanie Flanders, head of Bloomberg Economics. I've been impressed in the last couple of years by the ability for people to continue to talk about the end of globalization, the end of trade, even against the backdrop of an extraordinary trade boom, where we're seeing the lines of container ships and supply chain issues, which to a large extent have more to do with an excess of demand for trade rather than anything else. So I think we can still say trade's not going anywhere, but how countries are now going to work together to make the trading system be part of a solution, a global solution for challenges like climate change, food security, national security, all of these questions. I mean, a lot of these things that we discuss over the week come down to trade one way or another, because things have to go from one country to another. So I'm delighted that we are having this session with some excellent speakers who I'll introduce in a minute. But first, just as a matter of housekeeping, just a reminder that if you're posting on social channels, you should use the hashtag WEF22. If you want to get involved in the session on Slido, if you're in the audience now, you could use the QR code on the screen. If you go to Slido, anyone who's watching, slido.com, and then you must do the hashtag #FutureTrade, and that'll take you to the polling questions. And we're going to just take an opening poll to kick off the discussion and get everyone familiar with Slido. So the question, once you get on there, to think about is, are trade disruptions likely to intensify over the next year? I suspect the last few years we keep saying it's going to get better next year, and it doesn't. But that's the question. So yes or no, are trade disruptions likely to get better over the next year? So just to introduce my panel while you're answering that question, to my immediate left, Valdis Dombrovskis, European Commissioner and Executive Vice President for an Economy that Works for People. We also have Minister Piyush Goyal, Minister of Commerce and Industry for India. He's also the Indian Prime Minister's G20 Sherpa. The Director General of the World Trade Organization, Ngozi Okonjo-Iweala, who's also a member of the Board of Trustees for the WEF, and carrying the flag for the private sector, hoping to get a word in against all these policymakers, Brian Peterson, the Chief Executive Officer of Flexport, the US company. So I think, do we have answers to the polling questions? Yeah, people are still feeling relative. In fact, I'm surprised that the no is as high as it is. We've got a decent showing for no. You obviously haven't spent long enough talking about the future of globalization in any of these WEF sessions. Commissioner, I think I need to start with you, because we've had so much conversation about Ukraine at this Davos, inevitably, and with the strong presence of Ukrainians here as well. Obviously, the European Union has taken a strong stand against the Russian invasion, and we've had unprecedented economic sanctions on Russia and Belarus. The oil and gas issues do seem to be testing the bloc's unity. So I guess I would ask you, we've done all of this, but is the EU now reaching the limit of what it can do to punish Russia?
First of all, it's important that EU and entire democratic world is responding strongly to this Russia's unjustified and barbaric invasion against Ukraine. So we need to do all necessary to support Ukraine to defend itself, to eventually win this war. We need to put maximum pressure on Russia to stop this aggression. And that's exactly what the EU has been doing, providing all kinds of support to Ukraine, economic, financial, humanitarian, also for the first time in EU history, military support. And already we have enacted 5 rounds of sanctions against Russia, and currently we are negotiating the 6th round of sanction, which indeed includes also oil embargo. And there it must be said that if you look at the pre-war trade between EU and Russia, 62% of Russia's exports to the EU were hydrocarbons. So clearly, if we want to get close to the heart of the financing of Putin's war machine, we need to act on hydrocarbons. And that's why those sanctions also against oil are so important. So I hope that EU member states will be able to agree and move forward also on this. Because otherwise we are in somewhat paradoxical situation. We are providing massive support to Ukraine with one hand, and then we provide financing to Putin to continue its war with another hand. So this clearly has to stop.
And just to follow up on that, because there's obviously much discussion around the use of rubles. You know, the Commission's guidance on that is quite clear on the gas purchases, that people should open a euro account if the transaction clears. But quite a lot of gas companies seem to be opening up ruble accounts. So I just wanted to clarify for you, is that a breach of the sanctions as far as you're concerned?
Basically, there are contracts, and a vast majority of contracts are either in euros and dollars. So our position is that those payments need to be made in euros and dollars, and any further currency conversions have to take place afterwards. So that's the position that we have been taking on this. But it must be said that also, regardless of sanctions, we need to move away from the dependency on Russian fossil fuels. In the EU, this strategic decision is taken. We recently came with what we call Repower EU plan, outlining how exactly we'll be doing this and how we'll be moving away from those supplies of Russian fossil fuels.
Minister, well, you won't be surprised that I will ask you a question on this topic. India's made it very clear that it needs to buy cheap oil from Russia. It's buying more oil, discounted Russian oil, and it buys more Russian weapons than any country in the world. The US has been understanding about India's position, has said they're sort of playing the long game, because they believe ultimately that the US is the key strategic partner for India. So can I just ask you, what steps are you taking over the longer term to reduce dependence on Russia, even as you buy more from Russia right now?
I think we've been very clear from the beginning that dialogue is the way forward. We must sort out this dispute. It's doing nobody any good. And it's important that all the concerned countries and the neighbors find a solution to this very, very unfortunate conflict. In terms of India's own dependence on oil from Russia, we have never traditionally been a very large importer of petroleum products from Russia. In fact, on an earlier occasion, our foreign minister has clarified that we buy less petroleum products from Russia in a month than what is consumed or bought by the European countries in an afternoon. So therefore, I think any suggestion that India is increasing imports from Russia or is anyway contributing to the situation certainly doesn't stand scrutiny. Over the years, they've been a friend of India, and we believe that the right way would be to find an amicable solution, keeping in mind everybody's concerns, everybody's point of view. In terms of the long term, India has always looked at diversified sources for our petroleum requirements. But in the current situation, when inflation is at an all-time high, it has caused severe stress to people all over the world. The European Union and other countries in Europe continue to buy far, far more larger quantities than India has ever even thought of buying or will ever buy. So I don't think at all India at this point of time is in any way responsible for the petroleum exports of Russia. Having said that, I must also place on record that I was personally advised that there is no sanction on petroleum production, petroleum goods or food grain procurement from Russia, and no sanctions have been placed on that by senior leaders of the coalition which has put in the sanctions. So I think India is well within the current framework which has been designed by the countries who have put in the sanctions.
And just as a follow-up, and with apologies to the audience, but at Bloomberg we have reporters who are just trying to get to the details, and trade is all about the details. So just explain to me, if Russia's locked out of SWIFT and has the sanctions on it, have you agreed a payment mechanism for the Russian imports? I'm just wondering how Indian banks can get the money to Russia without violating sanctions.
Well, I'm not handling that subject, but I would assume that it would be no different from the way other countries are procuring petroleum products.
But I think there is a question about whether or not you're going to be doing it in rubles, whether you've established a mechanism.
Well, as we just heard, every country has to look after its national interests. I think our interests are no different from the interests or the needs of the European people.
Dr. Ngozi, obviously one of the very worrying counter effects or side effects of the crisis in Ukraine is this growing fear of a food crisis and global food shortages. What practically are you thinking about in your position to help governments respond to this crisis? Is there anything that the WTO can do?
Well, thank you. Certainly, the food crisis is a real worry. And it's not just about this year. I think it might be about next year, even beyond that. And the reason I'm saying that is if countries are not able to get fertilizer to plant the next crop, those that need fertilizer, then yields are going to be lower. There will be less supply in the world across the board of all types of grains and food. If we are not able to evacuate the 25 million tons or thereabout of Ukrainian grain that is presently stored, and the harvest is next month for another 25 million tons, then that's going to be really, really difficult for the world. So I'm saying that this food crisis is real, and we must find solutions. Of course, if the war stopped, that would be the quickest and best solution for everyone. But absent that, if we had corridors open on the Black Sea to evacuate some of Ukrainian grain, that would help. If we don't find solutions, of course, the countries that would suffer would be the countries, the poorer countries of the world. Now, at WTO, what are we trying to do? One is not to exacerbate the problem by having export restrictions or prohibitions of members, because that tends to take the prices, make for more volatility, and you know, prices can spike if we do that. So our members, the message to them is to try to restrain, although it's not against WTO rules. If you have that, there's a security clause that allows that to be done, but it has to be temporary, proportionate, and transparent, and reported to the WTO. But so far now, we have about 22 members who have export restrictions, and the idea is for that to be lower so we don't exacerbate the problem. I think our members have taken that on board. The second issue that we're looking at is, of course, how to multiply the supply on the world market. So any country that has additional grains that they can put on the world market, we're encouraging that very much to be the case. This is a global solidarity issue and a food prices issue. So that's a third thing we're looking at. And of course, supporting countries, especially poor countries, let's take countries in Africa to produce more for themselves, is also for the medium to long term a good objective. The African Development Bank's board has just approved $1.5 billion to support African countries to produce more of their own. They certainly have the land to do so. So these are you know, some of the things that one can talk about. But I really think we ought to work very hard to see how we can evacuate the Ukrainian grain in the short term.
Well, because if Ryan Peterson will humour me for a second, because you've just mentioned that specific issue, can I come back to you, Commissioner, very briefly, just to ask, are you talking to Russia about creating solidarity lanes in the Black Sea to allow grain shipments from Ukraine?
First of all, in this conflict, we need to be clear who is aggressor, who is victim. And it's Russia's unprovoked and illegal aggression against Ukraine, which is creating the problem. So correspondingly, we are engaging with Ukraine, trying to help Ukraine to deal with this situation. Obviously, there are discussions on different ways how the grain shipments can be done. So already now we are ramping up the capacity to do it, and the shipment is already happening through the land corridors, through Poland, through Romania, and from those ports. But clearly, it's not a replacement. We're also assessing other land options to get to other ports. But clearly, it's not able to replace in a short term the sea routes and the fact that currently Russia is blocking Ukrainian ports, and this export of grain is not possible. And indeed, there are talks of creating those secure corridors, possibly also with some military assistance, which is guaranteeing the safety of the vessels which are actually crossing this Black Sea. So clearly, that would be the fastest way to unblock Ukrainian exports.
And if you were doing that, you'd be willing to offer safe passage to Russian ships? I mean, what would you be willing to offer?
Well, here we're talking about Ukrainian ships which need to, because let's not confuse the things. It's Russia which is blocking Ukrainian ports, not the other way around. So it's about, well, Ukrainian ships or ships coming from Ukrainian ports under whichever side which needs to be unblocked, because in meanwhile, of course, we are seeing other tendencies that Russia is looting Ukrainian grain from occupied territories. It's burning down Ukrainian food storages in other territories. It's destroying other Ukrainian agricultural infrastructure and equipment. So clearly, there is a deliberate action of Russia to create these global food security issues.
I guess that's why I wonder why it seems possible that you might have that safe passage when the Russians have made clear that they are willing to sustain an enormous amount of humanitarian collateral damage. What do you anticipate? Is there an incentive you could give Russia to allow the safe passage for ships?
That's why we're working on different directions. Of course, if there is a way to open those corridors for Ukrainian grain exports through the Black Sea from Ukrainian ports, excellent. In parallel, as I said, we are working on other land routes, beefing up capacity, simplifying procedures, administrative procedures, customs procedures, both for Ukrainian imports to the EU and for transit to other countries.
Ryan Peterson, with apologies for having gone into trying to get to the bottom of it.
It's great, but we're talking about Ukrainian grain, but Russia is the largest grain exporter. And what about Russian grain? I mean, we're going to have a food crisis across Africa and the developing world. You could have anarchy, see what happens in Sri Lanka. Millions of people may die. It seems important to get all the grain out there. I know that we're in the middle of a war and it's terrible, but we could make it not get a lot worse. I'm curious, we'd love to get Ukrainian grain, but what about Russian grain?
He's asked a question.
The question is to whom? There is nothing preventing Russia from exporting its grain. The fact is that Russia itself is manipulating the grain supplies, seeking some kind of concessions, taking sides in this conflict, subject to the grain deliveries. But those are manipulations of Russia. There is nothing really preventing Russia from exporting its grain. Russia's food supplies are not subject to anyone's sanctions. So there is nothing holding Russia back except its own malign intentions.
Yeah. So do we expect that Russian grain will reach the market this year, or is it not going to happen?
You know, I cannot respond this for Russia. At the beginning of the year, we were not expecting Russia waging full-scale aggressive war and Russian army committing atrocities and war crimes in Ukraine.
Can I say, Mr. Peterson, anytime you want to dive in, I welcome this very proactive approach to, if anyone else wants to question any other member of the panel, feel free. But as well as doing my work for me, from your perspective, because I can see you're sitting there just a bit frustrated about the lack of action on some things, you know, what are you seeing when you look at supply chains, when you look at the collateral damage in the trading system that businesses are dealing with every day from this crisis and from the other snarl-ups that we've seen?
Well, we've seen the last 7 or 8 years that you've had almost every single year an increasing level of disruption in global trade. Starting, you can go back to 2015 when we had a strike on the west coast of the United States and you couldn't import anything into the United States. We may have another one this summer. The contract is up for renegotiation in July. You've had 2016, we had the cheapest ocean freight of all time. Everyone likes to talk about expensive ocean freight. 2016 was the cheapest ocean freight probably in the history of humankind. Great for importers and exporters, terrible for the asset owners. They almost went, in fact, Hanjin did go bankrupt, Korean ocean carrier. 17, 18, 19, we had trade wars. 2020, we had a pandemic, which caused a collapse in purchase orders. And then the worst port congestion that we've seen all over the world, and trade has never been more difficult. And I think it's an interesting moment to ask, is globalization going to continue? Are we going to be able to continue to trade, or is it going to fray? And our system depends on peace, rule of law. We've built like an incredible amount of prosperity off of the global trading system that is at risk right now. And it's terrible to see the human implications of that. And it has me very, very concerned because we look at what happened with the Arab Spring and all these government, really anarchy almost in the Middle East, and that was really the result of high food prices. And I don't know how to make predictions because my predictions have been wrong the last few years, but I'm still willing to do it, and I predict you're going to see similar levels of crisis across any food importing nation, especially the poor ones that don't have fossil fuels. And that has me very, very concerned, yeah. And
I think if there hadn't been so many other things going on, we'd be much more focused on the slowdown in China. But just to quickly ask you about that, our economists have a nowcast for China that shows the economy shrinking in April. Every set of data that comes out is forcing people to revise down their growth forecasts. Obviously, quite extensive lockdowns now in China. What kind of a mess is that creating, as far as you can see, in terms of these further disruption in trade?
I mean, it's a little hard to say. I think I'm glad that I'm not in the position, actually, really, of any of you have much harder jobs than me. I'm trying to run a global logistics technology platform. But in China, you know, the population is so big, India as well, that when you have to make a decision and you say, well, it's 0.1% of people, you get gigantic numbers of deaths. And so that's an incredibly difficult balance to weigh. I'm glad again, I couldn't do your guys' jobs. But they have made a decision to take health and safety and put that as a priority. I think it'll be temporary. I think you're going to see that Chinese factories are going to come back to life in the next few weeks in the Shanghai area. And I hope that, you know, China's really the example. They've lifted up 500 million people out of poverty through adoption of economic integration with the West, with the trade. And I think that recipe has served them quite well. So I hope that we'll see them continue down that path.
Now, there are quite a lot of questions coming in, and we've managed to answer a couple of them already, but I encourage everyone to put their questions. Dr. Ngozi actually mentioned the question about food security and potential what might be considered food protectionism. So there is a question, how does India intend to prevent its recent wheat export ban from negatively affecting food security in developing countries? And I see you've also limited sugar exports.
Yeah, I'm glad you asked that question because there's a lot of misinformation going around the place. In fact, yesterday, the Director General WTO and I had a conversation on this. I had a conversation with my friend Valdis this morning and with Kristalina of the IMF, who I think inadvertently, for lack of the whole picture, made a suggestion that we should lift the wheat ban as soon as possible. And after I explained the whole context to her, she actually said that I'll have to set the context right in some future engagement. I'd like to share a little perspective. It may take me a couple of minutes. India traditionally has never been an exporter of grain, wheat. In fact, many years ago, we were importing grain. Our farmers toiled and we got the green revolution into India. We got self-sufficiency in rice, then in wheat. And over the last many years, we only have been producing for our own requirement. Until 2 years ago, India had no exports of wheat at all. 2 years ago, we had a nominal surplus of 2 million tons, which is barely 1%, only 1% of global wheat trade that we had as a surplus, which we allowed to be exported. Last year, and our year ends in March, in the first 9 months until December, there was a very nominal export. The world didn't need any of our wheat, and we also didn't have any great surpluses. In the January to March period, due to the conflict between Ukraine and Russia, we suddenly saw a spurt of wheat exports, but we welcomed it. We could help many people. Most of our 7 million tons that went in the last year went to Bangladesh and other less developed countries, and we were very happy that we could support them. This year, starting April, our estimate was that we would produce 111 million tons, against which our domestic requirement and consumption is about 105 million tons. So we thought we would have about 6-7 million tons again, which we could export. Unfortunately, there was a huge climate problem. We had a heat wave in most parts of North India, which is in public domain. Most people, I'm sure, know about it, due to which the wheat got shriveled and our production fell significantly. In fact, Dr. Ngozi feels it has fallen even more than what we estimate, due to which we would actually have to draw from our food security reserves to even ensure price stability and food security of the people of India. In this situation, from 1st April to 10th of May, in 40 days, our wheat exports increased 6 times, 600% of what had happened in the 40 days last year. So we saw 2 million tons go in only 40 days. And the speed with which it was going, we would have had a crisis in our own country for food stability, food security, and pricing. And therefore, it was an imperative that we regulate what is being exported. Even now, we have left the window open for countries on a government-to-government basis to take wheat from India, because we don't want the surplus wheat available, if any, to go into the hands of speculators or hoarders who would then charge an arm and a leg to the less developed countries or the poorer countries who would need that, or the vulnerable countries who would need that grain. We analyzed the exports and we found instead of Bangladesh or the less developed countries, it was actually being exported to trading centers from where they would have all the ability to manipulate prices, and therefore we regulated it. We've left the window open for government-to-government contracts. We have requested the World Trade Organization to remove the condition that we cannot use our grain stocks procured for food security for supporting the governments who needed the vulnerable countries. If WTO would consider removing that clause, there would be many countries whom we could help with their grain requirement. I must also share with you that our public procurement this year fell from a normal 43 to 45 million to only 18 million, and the procurement season is over. So even our food security stocks this year are quite stressed, and we support 800 million poor in our country through these food security stocks. And you would be happy to know that through the COVID period, we doubled the entitlement of our poor for free food grains, because of which India can today proudly say, despite all the challenges of COVID, we did not have a single starvation death through the COVID period and now. Not a single starvation death, because the government was proactive, responded to the needs of our poor, and gave 800 million people regular supply of food grains, using technology in a big way through a biometric digital authorization to make sure the right person got the grain, got it anywhere in India through one nation, one ration card, the entire database being technologically driven. And therefore, we believe this is a step in the right direction to ensure equitable and social distribution of any surpluses that we have.
Just very briefly, because as Dr. Ngozi pointed out, this is going to be potentially a long-running crisis, because the implication, the effects of what's happening now will live on through the impact on fertilizer and on crops in the future. So just quickly, it doesn't seem like the limits you've just put on are going anywhere. I mean, is your expectation that they will now be in place for some time? The sugar and the wheat controls?
Well, in the sugar also, last year, our total sugar exports was 10 million tons. And we have said in our regulation that we will continue to look at a 10 million ton export, but we'd like to make sure that speculators and hoarders don't get a handle on it, and the most deserving, vulnerable, less developed countries get a priority on the excess stocks that we have. So if you'll read the regulation, it's very categorical. Every country, the European countries have had many regulations in the past. Today, there are 22 countries, as the DG pointed out this morning, who have regulations on food exports to protect their own security, food security. And I think different countries at different points of time have had to take extraordinary measures in public interest.
Dr. Ngozi, you have your first big day out, if you like, the ministerial conference in June, WTO ministerial conference. What are the concrete, what we used to call deliverables that are going to come out of that conference? What should we look for?
First of all, I think is the conference of the members. So I want to make sure it's a member-driven organization, and we're there as a secretariat to support them and back them. So the outcome of the conference will depend on what the members do and want.
So you're not thinking about it?
Sorry?
You haven't got some ideas about what they might think about?
No, I absolutely do. That's my job, to have an idea. So I do have ideas about what they do, but I don't control how they finally end. So that being said, there are 4 pillars that we're looking at. There's a whole pillar on reforming the WTO, which is really important because the WTO needs to be made fit for the 21st century challenges. It's a very important organization that needs to deliver for both developing and developed countries. But of course, to do that, it has to, its rules need to be, upgraded. Its negotiating function, its monitoring function, and the dispute settlement function, part of which has not been working for some time, also needs to be reformed. So there's a whole agenda on WTO reform that members would like to agree a process on. So it's not that the reform itself is going to be done at MC12, but we need to agree how to take this forward and have a game plan, that is a calendar for achieving those reforms, and see where we get at MC13. I think the second pillar we want to look at is the response to the pandemic. The pandemic has been going on for some time, and members have been asking themselves, how does the WTO and its respond to this? So we are in the midst of negotiating some agreement that we can take forward to MC12. Many people know about the TRIPS intellectual property waiver that developing countries put forward. And for quite some time, we didn't make progress on that. But recently, members have started on a text-based negotiations. It's a little bit complicated, but we're hoping that there'll be an outcome which we can take to MC12. But that's not all. There's another part of the response to the pandemic which has to do with trade and health measures. Again, how do we behave with respect to, let's just take an example, export restrictions and prohibitions, again, on medical products and supplies when there's a pandemic. So our members are looking at some of these issues, and we hope to have a package on the response to the pandemic. The third pillar has to do with fisheries. The organization has been negotiating a fisheries subsidies agreement for years, 21 years, and as everyone knows, I always say I'm impatient. I don't see why we shouldn't wrap this up after 21 years of negotiations. We don't have to wait until our oceans have no fish before we agree on this. Already it's almost 50% overfished. There's the livelihood of poor fisher women and men that depend on this. So we hope that we can move forward. Let me put it that way, move forward on the fisheries subsidies and if possible, come to an agreement. The last pillar, very quickly, is agriculture, which has been being negotiated for even longer than the fisheries subsidies. And there are very distinct divides there. So we're hoping that we can take a base forward to the MC12 for moving forward. So those are the main pillars, but there are also other aspects. You know, there are some what are called plurilateral agreements going on e-commerce, which will upgrade WTO rules to underpin digital trade. We have some activity on environment, on women in trade. So there are lots of interesting things that we are bringing forward. Also a food security agreement that we hope to sign. Something on the World Food Programme humanitarian agreement. So we have lots of things on the menu. I hope out of this menu, we can agree a few of these as deliverables, as you call them.
May I? I must compliment the Director General, Ms. Ngozi, because it's a very tough job she has on her hands. I don't think any of us would envy her job. Nobody would like to be in that seat in the current challenging times, particularly when she has to balance the interests of the less developed or very poor countries, the developing world, which has the the smaller income, the middle income, the higher income, all within the developing world, and then the very developed countries. So there's a very fine balance. On a bilateral basis, it's always easier, but multilaterally, to come to a solution on with so many different interests and balance them fairly and equitably. A very, very tough job. I compliment her for her patience, for her ability to bring so many different interests on the table and persevere for a solution.
All right, well, I'm sure she's very glad to have that compliment, but why don't you help her? How are you going to actually help her?
We are all helping, and I think we've all agreed, even today, in an earlier session, to look at how a political consensus can be drawn, trying to bring equity with different interests on the table.
So there's a couple of ways to go here, but I think a lot of conversations that people will have been in this week, in one way or another, ended up with the fragmentation of the global economy, and can global institutions still function? Do they still have a role when major members of those institutions no longer seem to be heading in the right direction? So you talk about the plurilateral agreements. You say it's much easier to be on a bilateral footing. How do you make the WTO fit with a world in which people don't agree?
First of all, what is right or wrong depends on the lens with which you look at it. Everybody is protecting their national interests, but at the same time trying to balance the public good or what's good for the whole world. And I think in that situation, we'll all have to be patient. If we try to push things through, it's going to land up creating more problems. And to my mind, all of us, the members of the WTO, are completely in solidarity with the effort the Secretariat and the teams are making. We all have different interests. The US has different interests, Europe, India. Amongst the developing world, we have countries with $2,000 per capita income, 10,000 and even 20,000. So everybody would have a different interest. So I think it's work in progress, and we should give it more time. Many areas, agriculture, as she said, is going on for 30 years. So we have to come to a conclusion on many issues.
Commissioner, how are you going to help Dr. Ngozi have a successful ministerial conference?
Well, indeed, I would say, especially in current geopolitical situation, it's important to preserve the role and strengthen multilateral organizations and clearly World Trade Organization. So we are heading towards this 12th ministerial conference in a constructive spirit, willing to facilitate agreements. In fact, on a number of topics, we had come forward with concrete proposals, like concerning the WTO reform itself, because it's clear that also the WTO rulebook needs to be brought in 21st centuries and also reflect changed realities, changed economic realities which we are facing. I fully agree we ought to conclude fisheries subsidies agreement and not to lose sight of the environmental objectives of this agreement, to avoid illegal, unreported, unregulated fishing, to avoid overfishing, to ensure that our fish stocks are actually sustainable. That's our global responsibility, to work on agriculture. And now obviously there is a urgent issue to deal concerning the food security, where World Trade Organization obviously has a word to say. Discussions concerning various aspects of e-commerce, pandemic, post-pandemic issues. So there are many issues to be dealt with, and indeed we need to work in a constructive spirit and seek practical, tangible outcomes at MC12.
Well, thank you, Stephanie, for eliciting so much love for me. It's wonderful. I just want to say that, you know, as Piyush mentioned, it's very difficult to agree things multilaterally, and that has been plaguing the WTO, and we shouldn't make light of it. And that's why we need to find ways forward to agree some things to show that the organization can function. But what I wanted to say is, let's not take the multilateral trading system lightly. You know, people are talking a lot of fragmentation, of moving away from multilateralism. In practical terms, there's a lot of geopolitical tension. But the counterfactual to having a multilateral organization, people need to look at that. It's very costly. And you know, only the poorer and weaker countries would suffer, because if you don't have such an organization, imagine a poor country in a developing part of the world trying to have a bilateral agreement with a larger country. How do you think that will look? If you had to do that for almost everything, it would be very difficult. So we need that multilateralism. Lastly, some problems we have now of the global commons cannot be solved by any one country alone. And we are facing this simultaneous crisis of the global commons, which needs the kind of solidarity that a multilateral setting provides. Therefore, you can't solve the pandemic on your own. You can't solve climate change on your own. You can't even solve food on your own, because we have net food importing countries who don't have the ability to grow their own food. So we are in it together. And therefore, that's why we need to strengthen organizations like the WTO and make sure we don't take it lightly about its breaking or falling apart.
I've just noticed we've practically run out of time. But there's quite a few questions to Ryan Peterson, so I think I'm going to end up maybe giving you the last word, but there's a couple of questions, but basically there are various versions of the same one, which is, can you tell us how IT can help solve some of the trade disruptions that we're seeing?
Yeah, and so I run a technology company, so you probably think I'm going to talk about big data or machine learning, satellites, but actually the technology that I think is going to be the most important in the next year or two is an ancient one. We've actually 2,000 years ago, maritime insurance was invented in Rome to provide security for people who were going to Egypt to get grain and bring it back to Rome. And we're going to need to find insurance solutions so that ships can go into the Black Sea in a war zone, get grain, and leave, because I don't know that the private sector alone is going to do that. I think they'll end up not wanting to take that risk. If I own the ship, I don't want to lose my ship. It's too expensive. And this is where a role for government perhaps could come in and provide some kind of a backstop of insurance, as we've seen in many other places. But I think something like that is probably the most important technology right now.
Well, like many conversations this week, it's begun and ended with some aspect of the Ukraine crisis. But in the meantime, we got a bit of help, certainly a lot of love for Dr. Ngozi. Looking forward to your ministerial conference and some explanations of the other elements of trade policy at the moment. So thank you very much to all speakers and for the questions.